captain of the vessel, I'm the one that's gotta steer it. My energy can't move like I got shackles on my spirit. Yes, I heard the news, they speaking on me, I can't hear it. Don't get it confused, you cannot choose who gon' be cheering.
Welcome back to the channel, Kimyo Space Cadets. It's the leader of the Cosmic Armada and librarian of K.O.D.E archives, Wolf Nara. And today I'm not alone. Today we have a pillar of the community, the man who exudes weights from hard work and consistency, sends shockwaves throughout the Ordeal community. Today we have my brother Jay the God Tier. Now I will have the channel linked down below. Be sure to like the video since that is YouTube's way of promoting the content for your eyes to see and others as well. And check out the video he produces as well. Now Jay, can you introduce yourself and tell the people why you are here today?
Our good friend K.O.D.E Archives, aka Wolf Nara, wants my opinion on conflict scaling within Ordeal. So we're going to look at that. In his words, it's essentially how the conflict grows in range regarding battlefields. So, or in other words, you could also see it as like how maybe big like a battle radius is depending on who's participating in it, or like the certain conflict of interest, right?
I essentially feel the same way as Jay in regards to the conflict scaling in Ordeal. More than not, when taking a look into the conflict scaling in the series, there are plenty of good examples, but also one that is really bad. When introduced to a specific area when a conflict takes place, Brent makes the environment meld into the combat, and people typically forget about the environment during the conflict. And not only that, also how it correlates with how we view the ramifications of the conflict as well. To some degree, the environment also would affect the way we view the upper end of talents of characters as well, since Brent mostly is able to display the destructive capacity of the character and their effects on the environment really well throughout the story. And since he mostly scales the destruction up for each major conflict, it will only make sense that we take a look at the environment of those conflicts, how he utilized the scale of each conflict during the season, and whether the Kimyo are scaling upward properly and displayed to the reader as well. Now, I do want to hear Jay's thoughts on how he views conflict scaling.
I think first I want to give how I feel about it as of right now, and I'd say I'm a little iffy on it because at certain parts it's valid and proper, and other parts it's a little odd.
Now, we will be going through each season and looking at some of the battles we've had to analyze if the conflict is truly good or bad. The first conflict of the story will be that of Leo versus Rokash. Now, this is the first real fight with stakes in Ordeal. Both Leo and Rokash have history with each other that is allowed to flow naturally throughout the arc. Now, Rokash is introduced as Leo's former student and is residing in the same dojo he had trained. Now, the dojo being the perfect background because it sets up an emotional weight of both characters. Leo will be viewed already as a master of his ability due to the way he was introduced as Shay's master. Shay is able to win multiple matches as a human against Kimyo due to these teachings. As Rokash seeks approval, on the other hand, Leo only sees regret, adding to the emotional weight of the scene. We then see during their initial meeting, Leo Flames being reactive to his emotions. So when their final battle begins, we see how easily Leo outclasses Rokash. As we go back and analyze with context from season 3, Leo, due to the mastery of his chi and talent, was able to reduce the damage he caused while being in an emotional state. While Rokash activated his talent, and since he has rock armor, you can assume he used it to mitigate the damage caused by Leo. This conflict not only moves the plot forward, but gives emotional weight that affects the narrative, in which the results allow Shay to be bequeathed Ephialtes by Leo. This is a perfect example of conflict scaling because not only do emotions of each character is currently driving the plot, it also allows us to scale the Kimyos in the scene even without any dialogue to cater to the power system and the power scaling of each Kimyo, but also allows the art to tell a story through the characters, and the environment is used really well. Keeping the conflict personal and to a smaller environment allows the story to scale to an even bigger conflict towards the end of the season. We see Leo able to get the upper hand on Rokash in martial arts, but we also see how he utilized the environment during the conflict as well. So when the Rokash is thrown in the air and Leo speed blitz past him in order to push off the ceiling, slamming him down, now Rokash is still able to fight, going to show although the ability of the former #1 Kimyo is able to hurt him, it would take more to beat him. Now, Leo dying to a bullet is a bit anticlimactic, but it also draws a point of Lord Grimson, which is the importance of valuing one's body. And although the Ephialtes vessels have a healing factor, it does not mean they can't be hurt. And so Leo's neglect of his own body in order to stabilize the peace of the world forced his body to break down to the point where he couldn't even heal from a bullet wound. We also have that reflect the lessons taught to Shay in episode 2, which is for him to value his body, and Leo questions what he would do. So Leo destroying the dojo not only adds emotional weight for himself, it also destroys one of the only places Shay could consider home. This interaction will also allow us to scale Rokash up from the club, while also making him weaker than Leo. Now I do want to take a look at a conflict briefly for the first invasion of Trinidad. Now, the Titan invasion scales the conflict upward. The previous 2 fights took place in buildings. The first is Shay in the MMA tournament, which didn't even destroy the arena. The next is Leo destroying the dojo itself. The first Titan conflict allowed Vail's army to invade Trinidad. This takes place not too long after Vail had broke the inmates out of Patmos. The Titans was tasked to hunt certain S-rank Kimyo. Now, we then have Kani Hime, who was able to take out an S-rank Kimyo named Ferrari through cybernetic enhancements and her talent. This portion of the first Titan invasion is a great example of conflict scaling due to the parties at play. We have 2 Kimyos weaker than both Rokash and Leo, able to damage the building but not ultimately destroying it. This allows us to consider Ferrari a weaker form of S-rank Kimyo rather than one of the stronger ones, which is not only in scope with the power scaling of the Titan as a threat. We have the second portion of the invasion, which is Ian and the police officers versus the 2 random Titans as well. Now these Titans are in a similar strength level as Kani Hime, since they are able to damage the building but not ultimately destroy them. This conflict also reveals the scaling for the humans in the series. We see Ian overcome their power through not only tactics but sacrifice, where multiple humans are knocked off the building with their tendrils without them moving from their initial start point. Experience is also a deciding factor in ordeal combat, in which we see Ian recount his experience from a former raid where they was able to use heavy artillery to create a smoke screen and subdue their enemy. In this case, Ian was able to employ the same tactic to get the upper hand, showing a restricted area limited both parties, which allows Ian to win. Now, we would need to reference season 2 to give more context, as Ian is a super soldier, which does well for him when we see him in the second invasion of Trinidad fighting more Titans in a bigger conflict. Now, because he is a super soldier, it makes sense that he's able to defeat them, especially when utilizing the lives of multiple soldiers as well, allowing us to properly scale normal humans in relation to a super soldier like Ian, who was created at peak condition in comparison to a Titan. So when the G4 suit is introduced, it makes more sense why both Brandon and Ian was awarded those suits. This part is also perfect for conflict scaling, as it shows how important experience is to fill in the gap between weaker opponents, but it shows that a bigger area does not always mean it is better. But it also allows you to analyze different things like characters, traits, decision making without the sacrifice of stakes for the fight. I do want to briefly touch on my thoughts for the Trinidad conflict. During the second Titan invasion of Trinidad at the end of season 1, we have a panel with Ian and his wife looking out at the destruction of the city. We see the scale at which the conflict is covering. There is a distance between each of the explosions. So when we look out from afar, the explosions could seem closer than what they actually are, since we're so far away. Keep in mind, we have multiple conflicts taking place during the invasion outside of the Titans, which is the Wolf Cubs versus Team Rokash, allowing us to have a battle on multiple fronts. Now, Jay has the perfect breakdown in regards to this conflict and how it ties into the conflict scaling of the series.
I also think that's a good example of like the fight scaling, because most of the fight is actually happening like in this area of Port of Spain, right? Like most of it's taking place here. We know Rokash is there because he literally says like, I think he like greets the city itself. And then we know the Wolf Cubs, Andrea, Jay, Ian, the Greyhounds, they're all there in that sort of vicinity to help the civilians be cleared out and deal with the Titan threat that is attacking that specific city, right? And then the city being the place for conflict is good because it adds to the characters, because that's where most, if not all of them, are from and have been raised in, outside of like Andrea or Ian maybe. But then there's also the fact that we literally see each team disperse as the fights like sort of begin. She sends Anton to higher ground, right? And then these 4 move out in a different direction while Andrea eventually stays with So we already have Anton using the city's elements to his advantage and to their advantage as a group, because he can get to higher ground. He's using the taller buildings for his advantage. And then that comes back later when he and Janelli actually fight, right? We see some of this rampant destroyed area. So we don't even know how far they are from this movement, but it doesn't really matter that much because the entire city can be used. And then we see Cass just sitting here. So Azam and Lewis are the ones to fight him. And then later on, I almost forgot his name, Anton, we see Anton get attacked by Janelli, and they're literally at the top of a building right now. And then in a different part of the city, we see Shay, Tevin, and eventually fight Rokash, right? So that's now, what, 3 fights taking place in 3 different parts of the city, right? And then, like I said, where Anton is fighting at is even better because we actually get to see how the buildings can be used and how they come into play with the actual fight, right? What's even better about all of that is, like, so we know they're initially fighting in a city. All 3 groups are fighting in different places, and then they eventually all coalesce to where Shay and Tevin are fighting Rokash, right? And then that fight entirely moves from there to where Cass was defeated, and then that part eventually moves to this area, right? So so using the sort of city is good for the characters because of it's where they're from, right? It's the initial starting of the conflict. It's the initial area we're being introduced to. And then taking a more minuscule look, we're seeing how this city can play into fights with Anton. Azam and Lewis are fighting Cass on water. So like they're in the water, like the outskirts of the city. And then that fight just goes into the air as well. And then in all of that, we're kind of seeing like little details and scalings of destruction, how strong each character actually is, or what kind of levels of damage they can do. So this would be another sort of good example of the scaling of conflict in regarding the area, because the area is used for like certain fights. We're literally seeing characters move from one end to a different end, and then it's not pointed out that they're moving from one end to another end. It's just a natural flow, right? Where they're going from one area to another area to another area, and then in the final area we get to see even more, types of destruction, right?
Since Jay did a perfect job breaking down the conflict with the Titans, I do want to briefly touch on the Gala incident. Now, this incident was fought on 2 fronts. This personalized conflict scaled down from season 1 last conflict, which allowed us to focus on each cub in Greenland, totaling 4 fights. Shay, Anton, and Andrea fight inside the Gala, which Shay fight was restricted, in which he would endanger those around him if he were to release his flames. This reveals the lack of emotional control that Shay is governed by, the lack of power, and it forces him to unlock a new form as well through that restriction. This ultimately allows Shay to be thrust into a higher level opponents naturally. So when he ultimately faces Jordan in training, it scales the reader idea of where Shay is in the series strength-wise back a little, while also giving Shay an environment to release his flames in. This allows us to scale Shay above a Titan in general, but below the likes of Jorn and Val. So when we see him in the War of Greenland, the power creep from Jorn makes sense with the environment he can cause destruction in, but also the control to mitigate the damage he causes as well. Lastly, we have Tevin in his fight, and I feel that this is a good use of conflict scaling because it scales the environmental destruction upward, and it also allows us to properly scale the prototype G3 suit that was used in the Trinidad War properly. Now, Brandon got beat up while fighting the Titan General in the suit, so it'll make sense that will be the limit of a normal human, while Ian was able to beat a lower quality Titan General back in the invasion of Trinidad, meaning the 2 conflicts with Brandon and Ian wearing the suit not only is a good idea of scaling power wise because of Ian being a super soldier is now known, so it'll make sense that Brandon will lose to one with significant less combat experience than Ian, while Ian, who is at the peak of human condition, wins his fight against the Titan General, giving us a quality power scaling difference between a super soldier who has the suit and a human who has the suit. Now, Tevin vs. Ryu Gasgan starts off with a small scale confrontation that spans less than a city block, now covering less distance than the previous bigger conflict. It may sound bad if Ordeal characters are eventually going to become intergalactic, but it is not the case in this situation, As Ryugasgan releases his state, he's able to affect multiple city blocks. Now, Tevin was said to be stronger than Ryu by Ryu after going into overdrive, and we see that with Tevin's high adaptability and the amount of chi he has come into play as a whole in regards to the defeat of Ryugasgan. So now, not only are these treated as individual battles, they all reside and move the plot, the scaling for each individual characters, while also challenging their philosophies as well. Now, each fight maximized not only the environment they were given, but they attempted to increase the range of their battle. And if they did, there could have been potential consequences. Shay battle would have endangered people that they was there to keep safe. Anton would have endangered his friends, and Tevin would have potentially endangered the city, albeit named planetary destruction. So if you want to rank it to potential planetary, I see less reason for why it shouldn't, since it'll make sense for it to be able to do something akin to that given more time.
I think the best use of that type of thing, or that type of subject, would be the Greenland War. It just makes sense that we have a battle on multiple fronts and it's within a sort of mountain range type of area. So of course we don't know definitively how big the distance is from one battle area to another, or how big the actual battle area is in and of itself, right? But the idea of Bjorn showing up so that Shay can take Tevin to another battle area, right? And then this is its own little mini battle, and then we have Shay showing up, blowing these guys up, leaving Tevin here right back to where he was at. But then on top of that, we have the conversation regarding them switching battlefields, right? This is originally where Bjorn was at, but now Shay needs to go aid them, right? Because Bjorn is more suited to fight Veal, right? And again, we don't know the range from where they are to where this is, but considering how many people are here, big these guys look, but also in comparison to how small these guys look, it could be a far distance, it could be a big distance, I can't really tell. But then we have Shay leaving, and then we have these two facing off, which we'll see later, right? Oh, there's also Andrea fighting Goro on the other side of the mountain, right? So when we look at that, I think it's really good to have that setting be the place for where the battle is held, because it allows multiple battles to take place without too much interaction, unless it's sort of absolutely necessary, right? Even when Shay arrives to help Tevin and Anton, he's in a close enough proximity to the battle where Jamie was, right? But again, we have Bjorn far enough to where his battle is completely separate from anything else everybody else is doing, right? So I just think it's a really good idea for that sort of battle in that scale to happen on that type of setting, right? On a mountain range where multiple things can take place. And the fact that Andrea is supposed to be securing their exit, so her battle is literally on the other side, it adds to the setting, right? And it adds to her fight being a little bit more different than the other conflicts that are going on, right? And then, yeah, we also have like the Greyhounds fighting in like the grander sort of militaristic aspect of the war, where we're literally seeing soldiers face each other. But then there's also the fact that it's not even just the mountain, it's also kind of like Greenland as a whole to some extent, because Bonnie is able to send Bjorn and Shay to where they need to go. So where Bonnie's at is its own battle location, right? But it's not necessarily by the actual mountain range, right? Or to our knowledge, it isn't. So you could almost say like an aspect of like Greenland itself is the setting for the battle, and not just the mountain range. As we see right here, we have Bonnie opening the portal, Bjorn dropping down with the immortal hide made very large, and then we see the actual portal here where the actual house that Bjorn is in the yard, right? Completely separate location from where this is actually taking place, right? And I think this is all good because it kind of adds to the stakes of the conflict, right? Everybody's in different locations, everybody is doing something different. Portal opens up here, and then we see Shay falling like a star right to the earth, right? And he helps. And I guess maybe it's the next chapter, because where they're fighting isn't that far from where Jamie actually is, right? So we see they're getting ready to fight, right? Like it took a brief pause to kind of regather themselves, and we can even see it in the background right here. Like this is kind of where Jamie is, right? And then we see it, Jamie, his soldiers, things are happening to him, and then Shay is like just close enough to throw a Contio, switch it to blue flames, and then it can create a ring of fire so that his battle and the thing that's going on with him and their opposition in close proximity, but Shay, Anton, and Tevin are doing their own thing, Shay can still provide some form of aid, even though, you know, the battles are completely separate, right? We have Andrea come fighting basically on the complete opposite side from where everybody else is, right? I think this is a good example of like battlefield setting and conflict scaling, to where you have a large area that you can have multiple things happen and it just makes sense, right? And then you can have people be in just enough proximity to affect one another, but then you can also have large gaps and large distances to where things can't happen, or things can happen on one side that completely don't affect the other side. Or you can have something like Shay and Bjorn, where we have two characters that need to switch places considering the circumstances, right? So I think this is a good example of that, and a good example of how to use a setting and how to use this sort of distancing to help advance the story, right? Especially with the fights and the writing. I think this is a good example of that.
I agree with him saying it's the best use of conflict scaling due to the amount of pieces at play, how they are utilized, and the expression of destruction caused. Now, Ordeal is small conflicts leading to a bigger one, as we analyzed up until this point, but there is a conflict that begins the most heart-wrenching point of Season 3, and Jay's analysis and criticism of the Azam and Yukiko versus Ephialtes fight is another thing I wholeheartedly agree on. So Jay, if you don't mind.
There's also like even Azam's fight with Ephialtes, where, you know, he and Yukiko are fighting in the same range, right? You see the like immediate area that gets damaged is far bigger than just this street, basically, right? Like we see Ephialtes kind of emanating chi or malice to some extent. I'm not sure what you want to call this. It's right here, right? And then actually what's really good about this episode is that we see Azam, like we see the, let's just assume this is like the accurate distance for these two characters. Azam goes from this area to this area, and then Ephialtes also like does that warp sort of teleporty type of motion from this area to right in front of Yukiko. And then Azam again runs right from this area right back, right? So we get an immediate sort of use of the area that we were introduced to, right? And then later on that area is expanded on, which we'll look at. So the immediate area that the interactions between, you know, Azam, Yukiko, the soldiers, the civilians is used at the very start of the fight, right? But then it's kind of taken further and the area is allowed to be expanded and used more when Ephialtes actually destroys the entire area, right? Through just the initial explosion and activation of Nightmaric Skies, right? And then we also get to see, this also helps Yukiko in like scaling, because Yukiko was able to protect just the shop, her and Azam, from the initial explosion that does about a few city blocks worth of damage, right? So if they were like here in terms of distance, the explosion took out everything in front of and behind just this shop. And then Azam's Bane in, because that really shows how much of the area is actually being used and how much of it was actually destroyed by Ephialtes, right? So the shop is here. This shows that his explosion took out a large area, right? Considering where they are. And then not only did it take out, it completely destroyed some of this immediate area, and then some of the outskirts are genuinely reduced to like basic rubble, basic damage that can actually be repaired if done properly. But this immediate area is completely gone. Like there's no repairing this, right? But then we move on and we actually see the area be used when Azam and the Azam's Bane actually clash, right? Which is the real point of this talking point, right? So of course, also you can also take like the sky into account. Like we saw the helicopter at the start of this section, right? Which kind of shows like the distance from the shop and the helicopter. And then we see Azam's Bane look up and just attack it outright. So you could also add that in, or take that into account if you really want to. But right here, right? So like this. So I mean, it would have even been a little bit better if Brent had made Azam kind of go more on the outskirts type of area. But the fact that the initial fight started within like a literal, like a road, right? Where you could put two cars next to each other depending on which lane you're in. Ephialtes destroys the entire area, and now the fight can be expanded on to where the actual conflict in its specifics are taking place, right? But we get to see Azam and the Azam's Bane clash and circle around some of this area that was created by Ephialtes, right? And it depends on, like, I guess it would more so depend on the writer, because maybe a different writer wouldn't want to destroy the type of area that is in to even better show maybe a character's perspective and how many streets they actually are from where they were when the fight started. It just depends, but this is a good example of like the sort of scale in terms of like setting and visual, going from something small to something big or a little bit larger, right?
Now, Ordeal isn't perfect, and we do have an example of bad conflict scaling, which is Ko.F.E versus K.O.D.E. Now, both me and Jay will be chiming in regards to this topic, so it may be a bit long.
Ko.F.E's fight would be a bad example of that, right? And I think it's a bad example because even considering where he fights in, he's not doing a whole lot, right? And this is why I said in my review that it would have been a little bit better if it's stated that Ko.F.E is like actively trying not to do that much damage to the area. In episode 158, Ko.F.E directly says, stay put while they clear the area for us. We need the state of Arizona to ourselves to continue this battle. This implies that Ko.F.E and K.O.D.E will be using the entirety of the state for the continued conflict, right? But as we see in the following episodes, that's just not the case. And Ko.F.E directly punches K.O.D.E in areas that just stay within the normal range of where the fight started, right? Of course, they're still a little far off from like where the train was initially hit, yet we're not moving in any direction or going in such a fast distance to the point that it feels like we're actually entering a new terrain in a new area of the state, right? Okay, so he punches K.O.D.E right here, but K.O.D.E doesn't go that far from like where he just was at. Even here, right? K.O.D.E punches Ko.F.E, ravine type of area, right? But again, it doesn't feel that far from where they just were. It's not like such a grand distance that the entire state is being used, or more of the state is being used to fight. So if the entire state of Arizona is supposed to be for them to fight in, how are we still sort of in this same like range of area, right? How is it that Ko.F.E and K.O.D.E are only zigzagging across the same sort of mountain range type of area?
Now, the battle takes place outside of any city and in a ravine area that is in between Phoenix and Sedona. So let's talk about the landscape in further detail. Now, the mountains in the background aren't typical in the capital of Arizona, which is Phoenix. These mountains are what you see heading towards Sedona, Arizona. In between Sedona and Phoenix is 117 miles. The range until you see the mountains is about 20 miles from the city. It starts transitioning around the hour mark, so they are about 60 miles away from Phoenix, which means the conflict would range between 40 to 50 miles. Only reason I would know this really distinct detail because I live in Arizona and took the drive there multiple times in regards to Phoenix to Sedona. However, J's point of Ko.F.E display of power not matching up with the environmental storytelling shouldn't go unnoticed.
It would have been better if that statement wasn't necessarily put in there to the point where it makes sense that they are kind of staying within this area to at least restrict damage to the state as a whole, yet Ko.F.E definitively says they need the entire state for their battle, yet they stay within the confines of where the fight sort of originally takes place at. And this would be a bad example of like conflict scaling, because you could have used the entire state in different parts of it to show how impactful Ko.F.E's punches actually are, being able to move K.O.D.E from one side of the state to another side of the state to another side of the state. Or you could have used it so that one attack from either character can do a lot of damage to a certain portion of the state, right? In that way, you're not only looking at scaling and showing how strong the characters are, but to actually use the environment that was stated to be needed to be used, right?
Now, personally, this is a bad display of conflict scaling, not because of it not showing the destruction Ko.F.E caused, but we have a similar situation back in season 1 with Lewis and Azam versus Cass, where it stated that Cass had the power to compress 3 nukes and Lewis was able to smother it with the weight of his talent, mitigating such potential damage. So if mitigation is going to be a factor, it needs to be an opposite reaction to the initial cause to cancel it out. For example, what Jay said on having a statement of Ko.F.E attempted to restrict himself because not only had Ko.F.E achieved the form he had never used, but as a power type, that should have also boosted him to a realm where they could hit cities and he could hit K.O.D.E away from them as well. For example, we have Phoenix, Tucson, Tempe that could have been hit, or even a made up city, or a one punch and Ko.F.E and K.O.D.E Kimyos land inside the city, and another punch, they punch them out of the city to give us that display of power in that new form. Not only would it support the narrative of Tyson affecting the state, but it will also show it after essentially being placed throughout the state because of the combat. But it also gives stakes to Kofi's mission as well, since now he's not only protecting the politicians, but the people of his home country, giving more weight to the restriction of Tyson, his own personal destruction, and his duty as a god tier in order to support that country.
And this is why this is a bad example, because it's said that one area is like the entire state is needed, yet we don't actually leave the sort of area that this fight initially starts in, right? It feels like we're in the same sort of range of, you know, what, 153, I think, right? When Sonya actually interacts with Konos. We have a good example and we have a bad example.
Season 4 has the biggest potential thus far, not only because of the use of conflict scaling, but also the use to scale those very Kimyos to that conflict. We may see individual conflicts that may culminate into one huge decisive battle that has had 3 seasons worth of build up and ordeal. Not only does the stakes have to match the players who are participating, because those characters may be changed forever, and that change may also change the way that they make their decisions as well. Now, I want to spend some time talking about the image Brent had released, but specifically the Bible verse itself and how it represents ordeal. We have the saying, there's a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. Now, in the story, we've experienced the peace portion, we've experienced the love portion, which is right after Leo's death, and how the K.O.D.E bound together or bonded themselves or got closer in order to get revenge for Leo and ultimately thrust themselves into the world and using themselves as each other's support. A time to hate reflects Shay's inadequacy and how through him blaming himself, he's causing destruction, and how that essentially even changed the color of his eye. And now we're at a time of war in order for them to get to another time of peace. And we also see this pattern, time of love, hate, time of war, time of peace. We also see this pattern with Leo. Time of love was when Jaime was alive and the rest of his family that we see, I want to say, in chapter 44. And we see how Leo was with his family. Even how he still has that same cocky nature, but this time he has other people that back him up. But this is Jaime's unit, the one who could turn himself into a stone, like Stone Golem, fox-like senses and reflexes. But this is Leo's family. We never really get a shot with Leo and everyone else smiling. This was Leo's time of love, even though it was during a time of war. Leo's war didn't come into Thanatos and then after. Everything after, up until when Leo retired, was Leo's time of war. Because Leo is a child of war, so he doesn't really know much peace. So this is Leo's love right here. A time to hate is the fight with Thanatos, and how that pushed him after the death of Jaime to essentially sacrifice himself with the intention of sacrificing himself to stop Thanatos, or at least in this case Cain, because he allowed the Sybaris to bite him, which is said to be fatal to Kimyo, in order to get the upper hand, ultimately take out Cain. And then we have time of war, and this is the Mato Hagan, the Minamoto Usamu, and then we also have the aspect of him being at war with himself through failing Rokash. And although when we see even in the earlier chapter that eats away at Leo through the death of Jacob, he taught them how to be strong, but he didn't teach them what to do with that strength, which is why he taught Shay and the other cubs values and bonds with each other over strength, like he did with Rokash. Now, although the Bible verse explained the different time periods of each character's life, but there's more to be dissected regarding the conflict scaling from that image. So let's hear what Jay thinks about the conflict scaling potentially for season 4 and what he suggests on how it could be or should be displayed.
Some of the conflict may even be in the ocean as a whole, right? So if we have something like this also kind of adds to that as well. So it's not just fights occurring in certain areas and covering across different types of cities, or where I looked at Bjorn and the Greenland War, where multiple battles are occurring across a mountain range type of area, or even somewhat Greenland as a whole, considering Bonnie is fighting in a completely different area from where everybody else is at. We even have potential for fights to occur in the ocean, and this can be happening in one part of the ocean, whereas this same sort of conflict can happen in a different part of the world entirely, right? So this will be kind of interesting to look at in this regard as well, because we're going to get to see fights occur in a different area as a whole. That's not what we're used to, and where we may also get to see basically like battleship tactics, like the game almost, and how that plays into how these fights sort of progress, right? Especially because most of the people here shouldn't be Kimyos, right? Like the way these are just regular looking battleships. I assume that most of these are just soldiers, right, from armies across different nations, right? But if you were to include Kimyos in this type of conflict, you could have haste users, you can have people who can fly, and you can make the oceany type of area, even if we're not necessarily on water, you can make it the terrain as well, right? You can make the ocean and the sky the terrain, because, and then what would be really good in that regard is, depending on who's actually fighting there, right? We can have people go from one, like, let's just say the fight starts in the ocean near like India, but then the fight, it escalates and moves all across the ocean so that they're closer to like England, right? Or I should say like by the fight's end, right? That'll show that we can actually use this like oceany area in the sky and show that the characters who aren't necessarily bound to the ground can move about so freely that their fight, and even if they can fight in one area and they can fight in one stationary position, especially considering the level these characters should be at and the type of destruction they could do, if we want to reduce that, that continuous area destruction so that buildings aren't being blown up, we can have those same levels of attacks used in the ocean, right? We can get those sort of mushroom cloud sort of effects, right? We can get those atmosphere sort of breaking type of visuals, right? Without necessarily destroying the terrain and the ground in the buildings. We can get that same thing in the ocean or in the air. So not only does it show a different way to show scaling and damage, but it's also another way to show the area. If I had to give like a final close on the subject as a whole, I think it's very situational. Characters like the Greyhounds or like the troops and the soldiers, it makes sense for them to be in those sort of larger groups to take up certain levels of space depending on where they actually are, right? Commander Henley, and he didn't have a lot of soldiers with him, but they were scouring the Yamanote line, right? So only a certain amount of soldiers were actually needed for that type of mission. But you take that and we translate it to the Greenland War, where a lot more soldiers are needed and a lot more areas being covered, right? So it's a little bit more situational. If I had to give like a final verdict of if it's like good or bad, I'd say more often than not it is good in terms of just like the setting. So I think it more so depends on what is being portrayed by each character and sort of how Brent wants to go about fighting or showing fights and scaling and like damage with characters as well, right? I feel like we have more good examples than we do have bad examples, because the only real bad one I would say is Kofi, though you could give other examples. I do think that at a certain point, I don't like I said, I don't think you need to state or how big an area actually is if you can show it, right? If you can show how big the area is, or if you can provide a sort of small little statement that only reaffirms it, a grander or more definitive statement isn't necessary. And then in that same vein, you don't need to have a fight be in such a large area. You can keep the confines of a fight to a small area, but that just depends more so on abilities and, character intentions, especially because it feels a lot more natural. And the only thing about Kofi is that it only feels odd for him is because he stated himself that such a large area was necessary, but then he doesn't actually use that whole area. I do think we have more examples of like the setting and the area being utilized properly than we do of the inverse, right? Not only should more of the area actually be used, but we should see more of that aerial destruction, right? That's the only thing you could really add to that. But outside of that, if you are using this section of the video, Nara, I greatly appreciate you allowing me to get my talking points across, help the video. Don't know how you're gonna splice it up, but I greatly appreciate it, man. Keep up the great work.
Again, I would like to thank all of the Space Cadets and also the lovely people from Jay's community who clicked on the video. If you enjoyed this topic and how we covered it, leave a like, hype the video, comment down below your thoughts on conflict scaling and the effect that it has on the story. And again, it's your captain and Jay signing off.